Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Zeitler. This lecture on Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father is a part of a series of talks for English 641, Seminar in Creative Nonfiction. Barack Obama published his memoir in 1995. A 30-something Illinois state representative from Chicago, a lecturer at the University of Chicago in constitutional law. And it was a decade again before he was even a U.S. senator, or let alone president of the United States. His only national fame at that point was academic, as a legal scholar, right? He had first black president of the Harvard Law Review, okay, and was as such was of course asked to write about that experience. This is not the book really that anybody expected, right? In his introduction to the first edition, or the reprint edition 10 years later, actually, Obama admits his original intentions were for a very different book. As the first black to be elected president of the prestigious Harvard Law Review, Obama was approached by publishers wanting any morsel of proof that after all, some progress had been made, right, in race relations in the legal profession, and especially at Harvard, given the decade kind of debates over Derek Bell and hiring there. He immediately compiled a list of hot and timely topics to be developed into scholarly position papers for his book, The Limits of Civil Rights Litigation, Community Organizing, the restoration of public life, affirmative action, kind of his views of Afrocentrism, etc. Yet, as he moves from Harvard University to the day-to-day political life of Chicago, Obama's projects become less analytical, more personal, less a position paper, and more narrative. In a flood of memories, he writes, all my well-ordered theories seemed insubstantial and premature. Right? And here I quote from that introduction of the book, where he says, when I actually sat down and began to write, though, I found my mind pulled toward rockier stories. First longings leapt up to brush my heart, distant voices appeared and ebbed and then appeared again. I remembered the stories that my mother and her parents had told me as a child, the stories of a family trying to explain itself. I recalled my first year as a community organizer in Chicago, my awkward steps toward manhood. I listened to my grandmother sitting under a mango tree as she braided my sister's hair, describing the father I had never truly known. Okay. Well, here's the context I want to put some of this in. Obama's turn from analytical and legalistic argument to a personal narrative and storytelling connects this strategic choice to critical race theory. A specific, though, a highly controversial theoretical framework present, hotly debated during Obama's tenure at Harvard Law School in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's associated with legal scholars like Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw. CRT, or critical race theory, sought to bind the shared voices and personal stories of marginalized people. While legal discourse legitimates existing class structures, critical race theory counters with personal narratives, or what Richard Delgado calls counter-narratives, of lived experience to lay bare contradictions in American racial and legal discourses, effectively to first subvert accepted dominant discourses that blindly ignore the stories and experiences of the marginalized, and second, to decenter the belief that there can be only one dominant story. Right? Underlining this theoretical approach is the idea that law serves to regulate the affairs of those who have the power, and too often by doing that, to explain to those who do not have the power that the ultimate wisdom and justice of them being in the position that they are. Right? All works out, Again, it's the majority kind of view. Right? So Obama constructed his book not about what he experienced per se at Columbia or Harvard, right? But what he learned by listening to and actively engaging in the stories of his family and his community and indeed of his ancestral background. Right? So I posted on the blackboard for you to read an example of the theory, Richard Delgado's 1989 Law Review essay, Storytelling for Oppositionists and Others, a Plea for Narrative. In it, he develops the term counter-narrative through a multi-perspectival series of interrelated stories about race. Right? Okay, and indeed, Obama at times in his book uses the term counter-narrative. It's coming from that Harvard, that discourse of critical race theory. On page 2417, then, Delgado gives what he calls the majority story about race in America. Right? And I'll read a little of that. Right? This is from A Plea for Narrative, page 2417. Early in our history, there was slavery, which was a terrible thing. Blacks were brought into this country in chains and made to work in fields, some viciously, which was, of course, an unforgivable wrong. Others were treated kindly. Slavery ended with the Civil War, although many blacks remained poor, uneducated, and outside the cultural mainstream. As the country's racial sensitivity to blacks' plight increased, the vestiges of slavery were gradually eliminated by federal statutes and case law. Today, blacks have many civil rights and are protected from discrimination in such areas as housing, public education, employment, and voting. The gaps between blacks and whites is steadily closing, although it takes some time for it to close completely. At the same time, it is important not to go too far in providing special benefits for blacks, because doing so induces dependency and welfare mentality. It can also cause a backlash among innocent white victims of reverse discrimination. Most Americans are fair-minded individuals who harbor little racial prejudice. The few who do can be punished when they act on those beliefs, right? The majority kind of view of race in America, that history, okay? We would say, what pun intended, a whitewashed, right, version of that, right? So Delgado goes on then, of course, to explain coexisting with that rather comforting tale, he calls it. There's another story of black subordination in America. History, and I'm again quoting a bit from his article here, gory, brutal, filled with more murder, mutilation, and rape, brutality than most of us can imagine or easily comprehend. This other history continues to the present, implicating individuals still alive. It includes infant death rates among blacks nearly double of whites, unemployment rates among blacks nearly triple with whites, a gap between the races of income, wealth, life expectancy, which 15 years ago, if not greater. It includes despair, crime, and drug addiction in black neighborhoods, and college and university enrollment figures for blacks that are dropping for the first time in decades. It dares to call our most prized legal doctrines and protections shams, devices enacted with great fanfare, only to be ignored, obstructed, or cut back as soon as the celebrations die down. Right? In other words, a totally different story than the mainstream story. Okay, and it is the story of the marginalized people that are voicing that other narrative that Delgado says is necessary and needs to be incorporated into our legalistic thinking, right? And in the essay, he describes another number of incidents and told from a multi-perspective points of view of the various characters involved, showing, right? And he breaks down with a we call close reading of these passages, what's there, what's left out, what's highlighted, what's not in the various different versions, right? Well, I would argue in some ways that Obama uses storytelling or counter-narrative to similar effect in Dreams from My Father, which opens like Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son with him receiving news of his father's death in Kenya, a father existing for him more in myth than in reality. What does he know of his heritage? Well, if we look at page 9, we get a story Here's Obama at the beginning of his text, imagining and what do I know about my father? Right? He was an African, I would learn, a Kenyan of the Luo tribe, born on the shores of Lake Victoria in a place called Alego. The village was poor, but his father and my other grandfather, Hussein Onyego Obama, had been a prominent farmer and elder of the tribe, a medicine man with healing powers. My father grew up herding his father's goats and attending the local school set up by the British colonial administration, where he had shown great promise. He eventually won a scholarship to study in Nairobi, and then on the eve of Kenyan independence, he had been selected by Kenyan leaders and American sponsors to attend a university in the United States, joining the first large wave of Africans sent forth to master Western technology and bring it back to forge a new, modern Africa. In 1959, at the age of 23, he arrived at the University of Hawaii as that institution's first African student. He studied economics, he worked with unsurpassed concentration, and graduated in 3 years at the top of his class. His friends were legion. He helped organize the International Students Association, of which he became the first president. He met, a shy, awkward American girl, only 18. They fell in love. The girl's parents, at first, were wary of this, were won over by his charm and intellect. The young couple married. She bore them a son, to whom he bequeathed his name. He won another scholarship, this time to pursue his PhD at Harvard, but not the money to take his new family with him. A separation occurred. He returned to Africa to fulfill the promise to that continent. The mother and child stayed behind, but the bond of love survived the distances. Okay, now I would argue, think about it, that this narrative that we're getting here serves the same kind of purpose, or that majority kind of narrative, right, that Delgado presents in his essay, right? What do we learn in this essay, right? That, the British came to Kenya, right? The British did what? They set up schools, right? They had a British colonial administration, The promising students in there were given scholarships, could go to Nairobi, right? Then, because the British could see that there was Kenya was moving toward the modern world, they were granted independence, right? Nice of the British, right? And they selected various leaders from Kenya to study in Britain and in the United States, right? So that these people could go back to their home countries after all of the beneficence of learning Western culture and westernize and technologize and modernize their country, right? So through their meritocracy, right, picking the best people from the African native population, they selected Barack's dad. At 23, he goes to the United States. He studies, works very hard. He's diligent. He's intelligent. All of the criteria that we look for in someone who is success, right? Unsurpassed concentration, right? He helps organize an international student union, like the United Nations kind of thing. Now he falls in love with a girl. Now race issues are there in America, right? But the parents are a little wary, but nevertheless they allow, they're fine with this. It goes on. The child is produced. He gets to Harvard, et cetera, and then goes back to fulfill that early promise of going back to Africa to help build a modern Africa kind of thing, right? But of course, there's a lot left out of that narrative, right? Is Hawaii a place with no racial history kind of thing? Hardly, right? Is British colonialism some, wonderful thing that went to Africa, and the main thing all it did is set up hospitals and schools? It was very, no. The problems, the racism, the colonialism, imperialism, all of that stuff gets left out of that narrative. What did it mean for somebody to go from tribal society to be drafted off into English schools and dressed in an English manner and go, what was that process like? Obama doesn't know. It's not in that narrative. What's the pain? What's the sense of identity loss? All of that kind of thing, right? Being ripped from one country to another. So much of that narrative is sanitized in there and put forward in that story, kind of. In other words, again, I'm arguing that narrative there sets up similar to the narrative Delgado is kind of using. So then I would argue that Obama's memoir, Dreams for My Father, essentially begins to deconstruct, to unravel, to contextualize this celebratory story of Western cultural values, and filling it in with the marginalized voices that Obama learns to hear and to value. There's millions of examples kind of this right in the story, especially kind of when we get to the Chicago section where he as an organizer basically learns to listen and hear these stories. So I'll just give a couple selections on that kind of to give you a gist of how I feel the book kind of works in this kind of counter-narrative way. So on page 189, we have the story of, for example, Mrs. Stevens, right? One of the people that he's working with in coalition building and organizing in Chicago, right? One of the persons that joins his team to help, right? There was the time I found myself sitting in the St. Helena basement with Mrs. Stevens waiting for a meeting to start. I didn't know Mrs. Stevens well, knew only that she was interested in renovating the local hospital, right? By way of small talk, I asked her why she was so concerned with improving health care in the area. Her family seemed healthy enough. And she told me how in her 20s she had almost lost her sight from cataracts. She had been working as a secretary at the time, and although her condition grew so bad her doctors declared her legally blind, she had kept that ailment from her boss for fear of being fired. Day after day, she snuck off to the bathroom to read her boss's memos with a magnifying glass, memorizing each line before she went back to type, staying at the office long after the others had left to finish the reports they needed to be ready the following morning. In this way, she maintained her secret for close to a year until she finally had saved enough money to get the cataract operation. Right? Okay. Now, how do we put it? Okay, what's major kind of issues in the Obama presidency indeed were over health care, Obamacare as it's called kind of thing, right? What the narrative does, again, and if you remember, again, going back, those of you old enough to have gone through it, etc., right? One of the major things is listening to stories. Indeed, if we were all around a table, I'm sure all of us have stories about medical profession and paying for medical and the effects it's had on families, and et cetera, et cetera. In this case, the woman works for a year to earn the money for an operation, and she has to work overtime all of this time, hide it from her boss, go home, go to the bathroom, get a magnifying glass to be able to read and write down in big print so she can go back and type the memo kind of thing, right? All of this type of thing. But how do we put it? It has to do then with the importance of telling stories, right? That a story, what's this story worth? Well, you multiply these stories by millions of people kind of thing, right? As a way to argue for Obamacare, for increased kind of medical coverage, universal medical coverage. Or in another one, while he's on the plane going to Nairobi, and he kind of falls asleep for a while, and he's back in his travels in Europe a few days before he left for Africa, and his meeting in a train station or whatever between Barcelona and Madrid, waiting for a train in the middle of the night, playing pool with another young man, similar age, etc., but very different kind of background from Senegal. Right? What was he doing in Spain? He was looking for work, right? Money what he could send back to Senegal, right, to feed a family and to support them, kind of thing, right? But out of that becomes a story about immigration, kind of, right, and a face, as it were, to these stories of immigration and the whole EU kind of, issues about immigration that have come up in the last decades, kind of thing, right? That Obama, again, fills his book with these stories, right? Different people telling stories in Chicago, et cetera, and in his youth, right? What he learns from Frank, and Frank, of course, not given much of a name there, but Frank Davis, a friend of and colleague and worker with Richard Wright in the 30s, published multiple books, edited various things, worked as a journalist for Black Press, and his views on kind of race, et cetera, kind of in there, the stories that he tells, kind of as a counter narrative, as it were, to the stories told by Obama's white grandfather, kind of, about what it was like in Kansas and Chicago, again, in the 30s. So we see then this pattern, I would argue, continued throughout the book, right? One other thing kind of I'd like to kind of talk about a little with the book is kind of how Obama structures it. And it goes back to the final section of the book, the Kenya section of the book. In the Kenya section of the book, how do I put? I look kind of, among other things, kind of as a literary scholar. I look at as a kind of answer to and reliving of and reconceptualizing of Joseph Conrad's story, A Heart of Darkness. And in doing so, the counter story of Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which in many ways Achebe, in his article criticizing Conrad's view of Africa in Heart of Darkness, Achebe argues that, I'm writing Things Fall Apart to give an African perspective that's totally left out of the Conrad European perspective of things, right? So, among other things, the Kenya section starts off in an airplane, right, leaving Heathrow. And if you remember the Heart of Darkness story, it starts off with a bunch of people on a boat, right, a yawl, Gravesend at London Harbor, right? And what's the connection? And this, in both cases, these are Englishmen in 1890. It's that England rules kind of the world. The sun never sets on the British Empire, and back and forth. And London, in some ways, is the center of what the world economics, therefore, right? And that boat represents that power, and those men on the boat represent that power. Okay, 100 years later, we have, the Obama book. London, still powerful. And the people on that boat, on that airplane, are young people going off to serve empire. Right? We've given them freedom, right? Africa, et cetera, but they still need our engineers and our advice and our technology and, our companies to run things smoothly down there that they can't do. But so that Obama then is surrounded by these voices in a similar way set up, right? And he reads this book, again, as he's reading a book to find out about Africa, and it's, again, somewhat ironically described, telling the history of Africa, but of course it's written by a white journalist from a totally Eurocentric, again, point of view. No African voices, per se, right? And Africa, in this case, too, is going to Africa is going to into the heart of darkness, into some jungle, into some kind of, primitive state, right? And he gets to Nairobi, okay, with his sisters, etc., okay, similar to, again, in many of the descriptions to Conrad when he arrives at the main station there on the Congo River. But then the heart of the book for Conrad is the trip down up the Congo, right, to the source kind of thing, right? Then the further and further he goes, the more it goes into kind of this sense of traveling back in time into a more primitive time, et cetera, right? And I'd argue that when we get Obama on the train and he starts imagining things and we start lining up the dates in it, it is a complete retelling, as it were, of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, right? And to the extent that Obama being a Westerner and a stranger to Africa and Europeanized, Westernized, right? Has to go through a lot of the same kind of, perception kind of issues and thoughts that Marlowe, main character, protagonist of Heart of Darkness, goes through, right? And Marlowe imagining kind of what it's like for these Europeans on the boat, and completely impossible for Marlowe to imagine, as Achebe argues, what the African point of view be, right? And Obama himself here also tries to imagine what in 1895 when the railroad was built, which is again the same time of the Heart of Darkness story, what the people thought about with this, train coming in and what it meant and how it would change everyone's life, right? It leads to almost to this, part later in the story where he has this dream kind of on it, and he wakes up kind of from the dream, and it's almost again kind of quoting, Heart of Darkness, right? I jerked up. It's on page 372. I jerked up with a sweat, hitting my head against the wall lamp that stuck out above the bunk. In the darkness, my heart slowly evened itself, but I couldn't go back to sleep again. So the next part, even deeper into Africa, finally to the village where his father grew up, and then the whole story, kind of, right? The true story that the first part of the beginning of the book left out. What did it mean for the people in that African village, contact with the British in the 1890s kind of thing? And here too, we get then the story that the grandmother tells parallels in so many ways, right? For any of you who have read Things Fall Apart, it parallels that, right? The culture, the wives, the yams. I mean, the animals, the way the culture, the rituals, the kind of animistic kind of philosophies, and then the coming of the British, who are first seen as strangers and myths, and then they get closer, and then they have guns, and then they bring administration and schools, and that Obama's grandfather then, right? Onyego Obama, kind of sees the British as the future, right? Wears Western clothes, right? Leaves the village under the same kind of almost curse that Nwoye was kicked out of by, his father, Okonkwo, in the Achebe story, and goes to work for the British. And the powerful kind of scene in the book when Obama opens up these, memorabilia, right, of his grandfather and sees his workers' pass, right, servant class kind of, his descriptions, his, reviews by his employers as to what he could and couldn't do, how he had to carry this pass around with him at all times to be able to get jobs. The whole kind of sense of leaving one's identity to serve the British, right? And it kind of, how do we put it? Sitting there, back there, we're filling in now what the trauma of that story is, right? What the trauma of that story of moving from the traditional kind of world of the village to the modern world, right? Of capitalism and European kind of power, right? And yet that same story is the story that kind of what his father did, allowed his son to get a PhD from Harvard, to go to Hawaii, to come back educated, and, et cetera, and his grandson, right, to become president of the United States, right? It's a complex tale. It's a powerful tale. And what Obama succeeds to me in doing in the book, right, is breaking away from that, traditional American success story. So let's have all the marginalized voices here. Let's have the people speak from Indonesia, from Africa, right? From Chicago, from the high rises in Chicago, right? Let's have all of these voices kind of in there to tell a truer story, right? Than the Life magazine, the photo ops, the kind of, story that otherwise gets told, celebrating kind of American exceptionalism, right? So to close, then, I've argued, or tried to anyway, by setting up the Richard Delgado piece by talking about, these issues, which were burning issues, 30 years ago, 35 years ago at Harvard and in American legal studies, right? Critical race theory and Derek Bell, Delgado, Crenshaw, these people, how they're trying to transform legalistic thinking in the United States, allow evidence which is kind of not, normally thrown out of court, But wait a second, this is the nuts and bolts of it, right? Legal language has gutted, right? Gutted the facts, gutted the emotions, gutted the tragedies, gutted the personal, stories into one legalistic kind of formula that it fits or doesn't fit, and we can say up or down vote on this kind of thing, right? There are so many other voices, and the Obama, in this book, is a very brilliant storyteller, and brings together, again, theory, practice, in very interesting ways here. And I hope that you enjoy that, okay? And next week we'll look at a very different memoir. We'll look at Hunger of Memory by Richard Rodriguez. And again, it deals with kind of things like what bilingual education, affirmative action with the Hispanic community in California. Okay, until then, thank you.